Today we're going to take a look at the oracles against the foreign nations in the book of Zephaniah, chapter 2. And the question I want to explore is this. What is the meaning of these oracles in the book of Zephaniah and in the wider context of the biblical canon? How are we to read them? How are we to understand and interpret them? This is a bird's eye view of the text. It begins in chapter 2, the first 3 verses, with a call to repentance addressed to the people of Judah. Then there are 2 fairly substantial oracles. The first one addressed to the Philistine cities, and the second one addressed to 2 nations on the east, Moab and Ammon. Then there are 2 more oracles. The first one against the Ethiopians or the Cushites, which is a very, very brief one sentence, and some people even wonder whether they should regard it as a self-contained oracle or not. And then finally against the Assyrian Empire. So I have 4 oracles against 5 different nations. Right in the middle of the composition there is one verse 11 which falls outside of this pattern because it proclaims Yahweh's judgment against the gods of the nations. And then in the beginning of chapter 3 there is a 5th oracle addressed to a city called the defiled oppressing city, and this is quite clearly Jerusalem. The first passage is addressed to a group of people called a shameless nation, which most likely refers to the nation of Judah. And these people are called to gather together to seek the Lord, which is then interpreted to mean to seek righteousness and humility. And the call is motivated by reference to the coming day of the Lord's wrath, which is described as the outpouring of the Lord's fierce anger, and the people are going to be driven away like chaff. So they need to change their ways, and if they do, possibly they might escape the judgment. Immediately following the call comes the first oracle against and this oracle is against the Philistines. The 4 major Philistine cities are mentioned, as well as the sea coast. 3 things are worth noting here. First of all, the oracle begins with the word "for." In other words, the oracle is attached to the preceding call, and it serves as a motivation. You should seek the Lord and seek in righteousness and justice. Righteousness and humility, so that you may be hidden perhaps in the coming day of the Lord's wrath, because this is what is going to happen to the Philistines. Secondly, no Philistine sin is mentioned to explain, give a reason why the Philistines are to be judged. The oracle simply describes the desolation of the Philistine land, but makes no reference to the actions of its inhabitants that might have led to this. And thirdly, the oracle finishes with the statement in verse 7 that after the destruction of the Philistines, their country will be possessed by the remnant of Judah. The oracle therefore functions in a way as not only a judgment oracle for the Philistines, but a salvation oracle for the people of Judah. These people will experience God's mercy. The Lord will be mindful of them and restore their fortunes. The next oracle is addressed to 2 nations that live on the eastern side of the river Jordan, the Moabites and the Ammonites. And in contrast to the oracle against the Philistines, here we do have a mention of the sin of these people, the reason why they will be judged. Their sin is the fact that they have mocked my people. In other words, they have expressed their contempt at some sort of disaster which had befallen Judah. This may have been the disaster of the exile. It may have been an earlier military defeat. We are not told. But the point is, the Ammonites and the Moabites have expressed their contempt for the people of Yahweh. They will experience judgment like the cities, the proverbial cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Their land will be possessed by nettles and salt pits and will become a waste forever. And much like the oracle against the Philistines, this oracle as well includes a word of salvation for the people of Judah. After the Ammonites and the Moabites have experienced judgment, the remnant of my people shall plunder them, and then they shall possess them, they shall possess their land. And herein lies a little problem. If you look at this picture, you will quickly realize that this is not a very attractive prospect for the survivors of Judah if they are to plunder and to possess this land after it has experienced such dramatic judgment. For this reason, it's not impossible that originally the oracle simply proclaimed judgment against the Moabites and the Ammonites, and it was then later on updated to include a message of salvation for the people of Judah. The oracle against the Moabites and the Ammonites is followed in verse 11 by somewhat more general proclamation against all the gods of the earth, which includes the coasts and the islands. When you read the first line, the Lord will be terrible against them, initially the natural assumption is that them refers to Moab and the Ammonites. But as you continue to read, other things quickly come into view. All these gorgeous islands quickly come into view, and you begin to realize that the idea is the Lord is going to be terrible not just against Moab and Ammon, but against the coasts and the islands of the nations. In other words, people who live at the edges of the world, and very importantly against their gods as well. So there is here a much more universal perspective that suddenly appears. The oracle against the Ethiopians or the Cushites is very brief. All we are told really is that they will be killed by my sword, the sword of the Lord. It is not explained why they will experience judgment, what is their sin, much like the Philistines. They are simply told that they will experience punishment. And then finally we have a proclamation of judgment against the Assyrian Empire and its capital Nineveh. Assyria's sentence is to be destroyed and become a desert and be suitable only to provide habitation for wild animals. And like the oracle against Ammon and Moab, we are told what the sin of the empire is, and this sin boils down to complacency and a false sense of security and pride. Finally, in chapter 3, we have an oracle against the city of Jerusalem, the city within which the Lord dwells, but a city which is soiled, defiled, and oppressing. The problem of that city is its leadership. Both its religious leaders and its secular leaders are oppressive, and this is expressed with some very powerful metaphor. The officials are like roaring lions, the judges are like evening wolves that leave nothing until the morning. So instead of being shepherds of their own people, the wolves actually prey, the judges prey on the flock. And when you look at this picture, the bones here, these are the bones of the people for whom they were responsible and over whom they had been placed to lead and to protect and to guide. When you look at the map, this is the picture you get. If Judah and Jerusalem are here right in the center, then you have nations that point to the different directions: north and south, east and west. You have small nations like Moab and Ammon. You have big world empires like Assyria. And so the overall picture of these oracles against the nations is not that they are so much directed at these specific people groups. They seem, when read together, to suggest that they function symbolically and represent the nations of the world as a whole. And this impression is strengthened by verse 11, which seems to have in mind all the nations, even to the end of the world, and their gods, who will experience the Lord's terrifying intervention against them. Note also that Assyria's sin is pride and self-sufficiency. It is her attitude towards the Lord, which symbolizes the attitude of humanity as a whole, of rebellion and pride against Yahweh. So where does this leave us with regard to our initial question about the meaning and function of these oracles, both in the context of the book of Zephaniah and the canon as a whole? We have already established the fact that these nations primarily serve as symbolic representation of the nations of the whole world, of humanity as such. But the message addressed to them and via them to the rest of the world functions in two different ways, on two different levels. Because the people of Judah, the people of Yahweh, paradoxically both participate and do not participate in that judgment. So the oracles against the foreign nations, much like Amos chapters 1 and 2, serve to introduce the final climactic oracle against Jerusalem. There is no difference between Judah and between Judea and the others. They stand on the same level ground. They have sinned. They will experience judgment. So Assyria's attitude of sinful self-reliance, expressed in this phrase, "I am and there is no one else," in a way describes the attitude of Jerusalem itself, and this is achieved quite cleverly by refusing to identify initially in verse 1 of chapter 3 the city. So if you are reading this and you disregard the chapter division, you can read this first line as a continuation of the oracle against Assyria. Only later on you begin to realize that actually the addresses have changed and we're talking about Jerusalem. So the people of God stand on the same level as everybody else. They have sinned and they will experience judgment. And so the oracles against the nations therefore describe the judgment of humanity, which will include everyone. But at the same time, these oracles incorporate references to the remnant, which is going to possess the devastated lands of their former enemies. The sea coast of the Philistines will be possessed by the remnant of the house of Judah. The Lord will be mindful of them and restore their fortunes. The land of Moab and Ammon will also be possessed by the survivors of my people. And the whole of the series of oracles, as pointed out by the initial word in verse 4, is actually structured and placed behind the call, following the call to repentance, as a motivation. So in a way, all this is relevant to the people who are addressed in verse 3. Seek the Lord, seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you may be hidden in the day of the Lord's anger. Perhaps you may become part of this remnant. So the nations symbolize simultaneously two different things. Their judgment is just like the judgment of Judah, and so they are the same. The message of judgment to them is also a message of judgment to the people of Judah. But at the same time, their message of judgment is also a message of salvation to Judah, because when the Lord acts against them, he will destroy Judah's enemies and restore the fortunes of his people. Within the book of Zephaniah, this message of judgment clearly refers primarily to the Babylonian exile. It is with the rise of Babylon that the Assyrian Empire came to an end. Jerusalem was destroyed, and the people of Judah were taken into exile. And so the judgment of Judah is part of and corresponds to the judgment of all these other nations. But within the context of the biblical canon, this message of judgment takes on new dimensions. And it becomes there a reference to the eschatological judgment which will be brought upon the nations of the world, and judgment which will destroy the enemies of the people of God and usher the new era of salvation.